We are under this delusion that the government is all knowing, all seeing. They got it together. They have these complex oppressive systems that just work by themselves. And there's some truth. Yes, there are systems, there are institutions that kind of like are self-propelled. But fundamentally, colonization is held together by guns and chewing gum. Welcome back. I'm Just Mike, and this is Drawing the Line. In the last video, I offered some perspective. Often people will pull things that you say and they will be like, that doesn't make sense. Like, where is this coming from? And I just wanted to at least spend a moment to give a little bit of context. But this is the video that I actually wanted to make. I wanted to give my attempt to name and identify some of the tactics that I see that are new iterations of repressive tactics, and what I refer to as the empire's new playbook. Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party famously said that power is the ability to define a phenomenon and make it act in a desired manner. And so this video is an attempt to define some very clear phenomenon, at least to me, that are pointing to the direction that anti-uprising tactics and repressive tactics are going in this society. The things that are really going to determine the success or lack thereof of organizing efforts as we move forward. And so here's a look at the empire's new playbook. I want to start with what I am naming broken silence policing. The name comes from an old policy called broken windows policing. Now, growing up, I grew up in the Southeast in the U.S., and I didn't know much about politics. I didn't know many politicians. I knew who the president was growing up, but I didn't know much about local politics or anything. But there were some names that you just came to know, right? And one of those names is Rudy Giuliani. Through hip-hop, I learned of Rudy Giuliani, and it was very clear he was a despised individual. It wasn't until many years later, in college, when I started to really studying like oppression and studying repressive tactics, getting to understand mass incarceration, I came across Rudy Giuliani and found out the reason why he was such a despised person. Rudy Giuliani is considered like one of the architects of the broken windows policing policy. Essentially, the logic is that people who vandalize buildings, who tag buildings, people who spray paint subway trains, people who throw rocks at an abandoned warehouse, people who sell dime bags or grams of crack on the corner, these people would one day escalate and escalate and escalate to the point where they would become this kind of like super predator, essentially. They would become these people who are irredeemable. And so if you wanted to stop these major violent crimes, if you wanted to stop the kingpins from rising into their kingpin status, then what you needed to do was get people at the low-level offenses and punish them harshly. Give them long-term sentences for small amounts of cocaine or marijuana. Give them harsh penalties for being caught as sex workers or even soliciting prostitution. Really go after these people, go after kids throwing rocks at buildings, most of the time which were abandoned, due to intentional sabotage of real estate in urban communities. Give those kids harsh penalties for these very minor infractions. And the idea was it would deter people from committing more harsh crimes. Now, that was the justification that was offered, but we all know that really it was about the proliferation of mass incarceration. And on a deeper level, it is about the imperative of violence to maintain colonization. And so, yes, there was an economic motive, but really it is part of the necessary, relentless onslaught of violence, of destroying lives that has to take place in order for colonization to persist. Broken silence policing is a reiteration of that in a slightly different way, right? So I talked about before about colonizers are not really that creative, right? Improvisation is our wheelhouse. We as Africans, we as people, the first people, or people who identify with the first people, the most marginalized people, we are the inventive ones. This is why they turn to us for pretty much all of culture, right? We are the inventive, the creative ones. What they do is latch on to a couple ideas that work and keep regurgitating them with more sophisticated technology, essentially. And so broken silence policing employs that same logic. And the logic is this: if you show interest or empathy with oppressed people, you like a bunch of posts, you comment on a bunch of posts, you share the post, that may lead you to taking actions of solidarity. You show up at a protest. You find a way to get involved and actually be a part of addressing the problem, confronting the problem, creating a solution for the problem. And so now you've gone from being interested and empathetic to being mobilized. Now, mobilized is dangerous because you are out there and you are putting your body on the line. You are spending your time and energy devoting it towards a cause. And so once you are mobilized, you actually become a part of the solution. You are engaged. Now, through engagement, you get mobilized, you encounter different people, different organizations, you get more educated, more deeply educated on the topic. And so something can happen once people are mobilized that is really, really impactful. There's a cross section between information, empathy, and interest, right? So you're getting more informed. You already had the empathy and interest. And then as you're moving forward, you start to feel a sense of agency. I can actually be a part of solving this problem. Now, that's something that is very dangerous to the powers that be, and they recognize that, and so they're looking for ways to cut you off from that point, because once you get to that point where you feel that sense of agency, then it is more likely that you will become radicalized. And I say radical in the sense of becoming a person who dares to believe and act accordingly, that you can actually make change in the society, that you can transform the society. You start to question the narratives and the very structuring in your mind of how society works and what your place in it is. After acting for a while, you start to realize that the world around you is being reshaped. The way that you spend your time, the things that you find interest in, the people that you have camaraderie with, you start to reframe the way that you view the world, and at some point you become transformed, meaning that you are irrevocably changed. A radicalized person can be radical for a moment and then go back to the status quo afterwards, but a transformed person has completely reframed, reworked the way that they see the world. And so the powers that be, these colonizers, they have now gotten to the point where they see interest and empathy and they say, hey, we got to stop it right there. And this is why they are banning TikTok, attempting to anyway. This is why they are hunkering down on social media. They have been for a while. If you look at Facebook, Facebook used to be a place that people would have intense political conversations. You look at your Facebook feed now and you hardly see any political content. If you look at Instagram, Instagram has just recently did something where they automatically created a function to filter out political content, and they checked yes for everyone. So if you haven't been in your Instagram settings, go inside the settings and find the setting for filtering out political content and make sure that you have it unchecked so that you actually will see a larger percentage of political content. They are coming after anyone who is putting out information that is leading to a ramping up of people's interest and people's empathy, because they understand that will likely lead a large percentage of people to mobilization, right? And so that is what we are seeing through broken silence policing. And I call it broken silence policing because colonization depends on a silent majority. You have those who are in power who are consciously making decisions that sustain the oppression of masses of people. You have the people who are marginalized and oppressed and have no possibility of ignoring the fact that they are marginalized and oppressed. They are acutely aware of it. They know that it is happening, and there's no way to ignore it because it hits their lives in every which way possible. But then you have this very large percentage of people who are privileged enough, who are insulated enough to ignore it, to choose to not pay attention to how the people held down the most by society are being treated. And so they are worried now because more and more of those people are breaking that silence. They are stepping up. They are questioning authority. They are also getting to the point more and more where they're like, I'm okay with letting go of some of this comfort that I have. I'm okay of rebelling against my own privilege, because people are starting to realize that the haves are getting more and more, and their ability to become a have is becoming less and less. And so that means that even though they were among the have-nots, just like all of us the whole time, they had held on to the hope that they could rise up. People are realizing more and more that no, you will never be. You could never in your life be one of these rich people. The next thing I want to talk about is what I refer to as meme propaganda. We all know what a meme is, but I want to frame meme as like it is a cultural idea that is presented in a very contagious way. Traditional propaganda is a long-term sustained movement of mass manipulation, right? So traditional propaganda is like day after day, year after year, in the media, in educational institutions, all throughout our lives, in cultural institutions, we are being spoon-fed certain ideas. And we are shown it so much that it becomes like embedded in our minds. And these ideas are intentionally crafted to serve the status quo. Meme propaganda is rooted in something new. The internet brought about the information age, and all of a sudden we were able to type into a search engine and we could get just about any answer that we wanted. And that was beautiful. But along with that, we could also get a whole bunch of answers that we didn't want. We went from the information age to the holy shit, there's too much happening age. We're being pulled in every which way. And so we move from an information age to an attention age, right? We are in an attention economy. Right? And so traditional propaganda is too slow to keep up with the attention span of today. And so we have the invention of meme propaganda. And meme propaganda essentially is propaganda that taps into some very base idea that people have, and it stokes the flames. Right? And so we see it in stories like beheaded babies. We see it in like Netanyahu or one of his people standing up and holding a copy of like Hitler's book and saying, we found this in the home of a Palestinian, and it's written in Arabic. It's a brand new book, not even a page turned in it, but somehow they found that amongst the rubble of a building that was bombed. People who are paying attention, people who are discerning people are just like, whoa, like people are buying this. And the truth is, there are a large percentage of people who will buy it because we've already been primed to buy it. We've already been primed to believe that certain people are a certain way. Palestinians, Arabs are terrorists. That's what we are primed to believe. And so when someone says, hey, that person is a barbarian, that person is a terrorist, then we say, oh yeah, that makes sense. One of the distinctions between meme propaganda and classic propaganda is classical propaganda had layers to it. It was sophisticated. It was very intentional. It was designed to stand up to the test of time, where meme propaganda, it only has to hold for the cycle of the trend, right? It only has to stay viable long enough to get out there and circulate around and then be usurped by another meme, another trending topic. And so it can be as frivolous as you want to be. You can put up pictures of an IOF soldier standing in front of a calendar and saying that this is the Hamas schedule, when people can clearly see, people who read Arabic can clearly see it is a blank calendar that just has the days of the week on it. Things like that you're just kind of like, who do they think we are? Who do they take us for? And the reality is they don't care if it falls apart. Now, it's worth noting that some of what we are seeing is just sheer incompetence. We are under this delusion that the government is all knowing, all seeing. They got it together. They have these complex oppressive systems that just work by themselves. And there's some truth. Yes, there are systems, there are institutions that kind of like are self-propelled. But fundamentally, colonization is held together by guns and chewing gum. They are in a constant state of desperation because they are attempting to do the impossible. They are attempting to denaturalize human beings. They're attempting to denature nature itself, to extract resource after resource after resource from the earth with no attempt to replenish, no care for the impact on the environment, and they do the same thing to people. They extract everything from us and expect us to just take it and take it and take it and live these partially human lives in perpetuity. And so some of what we see in terms of these propaganda stories that just fall apart is just sheer incompetence. Some of what we see is also just sheer arrogance. They believe that we are just that dumb, that we might fall for it. But the thing that makes meme propaganda especially dangerous is that some of it is intentionally stupid. I believe that they are putting out stories intentionally to troll us, to foster outrage. They want us to be angry at what we are seeing, to feel incredulous. I can't believe they would say that. Because that leads to outrage fatigue. They want us to get tired. They want us to feel hopeless. They want us to feel demoralized, seeing the onslaught of lies that are coming out, and the truth can't seem to keep up with the lies. So they want to outrage us. Another reason why they are putting out this meme propaganda is to facilitate catharsis. Catharsis is a dangerous weapon when people have pinned up anger inside, when they are really disgusted with what they are seeing happening in the world. They are seeing grave injustices and they want those injustices to stop, and they feel themselves boiling over and they are being pushed and pushed and pushed towards the point of getting involved. Catharsis is used, giving us these moments where we can be like, I gotcha, I caught you in the lie. These moments where we can play detective, and we can be, see, I know that video is fake. You see those men who are carrying weapons and like laying down their weapons? Those aren't Hamas soldiers. Those people, that whole thing was staged, because how do people get strip searched and still have the guns in their hands? Like that, there are videos that we are seeing and we get that feeling of like, I see you for who you are. And that is a powerful feeling, that feeling of like, whew, the truth caught up to the lie. Another aspect of meme propaganda is inoculation. Now, it's a double-edged sword, because we wouldn't see the movement that we see right now if it were not for the brave actions, the mindful actions of Palestinians in a war zone currently having genocide enacted upon them and having the wherewithal to turn on their phones and videotape what is happening. But one of the reasons why we are allowed to see it as much as we do, to see all the graphic detail, is because the state recognizes the power of inoculation. They recognize the power of getting us used to seeing trauma, the power of us normalizing seeing certain things. They want us to get numb to the carnage. They want us to just accept it as a fact of life and to go back to living as if, oh, well, it's just another war. This is just what happens in war. Another aspect of meme propaganda worth noting is the state is engaged in the process of projection. Now, projection is a very old colonial tool. For instance, Nanny, the famous Maroon in Jamaica. When the Maroons were active and they were coming in and raiding plantations and freeing Africans and building an army and going and confronting these enslavers, Nanny was depicted as some kind of demon. And the stories that were spread about them being like these savages, these barbaric people, were often rooted in the exact thing that the colonizers were doing to indigenous people and to Africans at that time. Again, these are not very inventive people. So when they come up with their lies, they're like, ooh, where can I get inspiration? What did I do to them? Let me say that they're doing that to me. And so projection is a core aspect of meme propaganda, because they got to come up with the material very quickly. They got to keep pushing out things. And so they have to draw from whatever's the closest thing to them, and that's their own behavior. We didn't do it, they did it. And it also helps get ahead of the narrative, and it becomes kind of like, well, I didn't do it, you did it. And they can present it as, you're just accusing us of the things that we already said you do. We kind of looked at what's happening, but I want to take it a step further and draw some conclusions about where this is realistically heading. And it's very important that I start by saying that I'm not interested in presenting ideas that seem hyperbolic or that seem like way out there in some dystopian future. So I'm going to stick to things that I believe that we are going to see within probably the next 5 years, if not sooner. The first one is we're going to see a mass proliferation of drones being used. And these drones are going to be used for 3 specific purposes that I want to outline. And we already see them being used for surveillance. So that's the first one, right? A good example is last year during Labor Day parade. If you're from Brooklyn or you live in New York, then you know that Labor Day is like the time of year. You see all of the people from the Caribbean come out, and it's a huge celebration. Well, last year the NYPD had drones that were going across and looking down in people's backyards to see what kind of parties were happening and if there was anything to be concerned about, any place that they needed to raid where illegal activity might be taking place. Also in Minneapolis, you had Border Patrol coming down and using their drones, to monitor protests that were happening in Minneapolis, and I believe maybe in Missouri too, and in Seattle too. You had the presence of drones that were monitoring people. And so we're going to see more and more drones being used to monitor not just protest activity, but probably other mundane forms of organizing activity, and drones being used as like a new arm of COINTELPRO in gathering information. In the very near future, within the next 5 years, I honestly feel that this will happen, is drones used as tools of psychological warfare, right? So in Gaza, there are incidences where drones have been reportedly flying over people's heads just for annoyance. So they have planes flying back and forth over people's heads, right? And so helicopters do this too. You can see this around college campuses. You have helicopters flying back and forth and circling the campus, right? You have drones in Gaza that are playing the sounds of people in pain, women yelling and screaming, trying to lure people out so that snipers could shoot them. You also have drones that are playing these loud, obnoxious sounds, attempting to wear people down psychologically. The next thing that I could see happening is weaponized drones. And here's how I could see it playing out. It's going to start off as surveillance drones. And people are going to rebel as we do, and they're going to start attacking the drones. And I could see them using the attacking of drones, the vandalizing of drones, as a justification to equip these drones with some kind of means to protect their property. And that will be the gateway towards weaponizing drones. And it might start off with something like pepper spray, or at first the use of so-called non-lethal or more appropriately less lethal weaponry on drones. We may even see things like the skunk spray that is used by Israelis. We may see things like that used as a deterrent, a crowd deterrent, to get people away. And then it may escalate to a further point. But I think it's going to start with something that is seemingly more benign and more justifiable. The last thing I want to bring up, and I want to be careful, again, this is not about fear-mongering, but this is where I can see, based on what's happening now, what is likely to happen in the very near future, as mass protests are inevitably going to break out more and more, and as we see cop cities being built, where cops are explicitly saying that they are going to be learning more aggressive urban warfare tactics, all signs are pointing to a strategy that is going to include kind of like a new wave of kettling. I believe that what we're going to see is the fabrication, the creation of temporary terrorist zones. And it's probably going to be called something else, of course. They're going to be protected areas or whatever they're going to call it. But they are going to brand certain geographical areas as dangerous places where foreign forces are influencing people to commit domestic acts of terrorism. And therefore, they have no choice but to go in and unilaterally demolish, destroy, to treat these people as if they are not people, including anyone who might happen to be in the vicinity. This idea of creating these zones really is built on a couple of things that I've noticed. One is there is this attempt in dealing with Palestinians to normalize this concept of the human shield defense. This is the idea that we see play out over and over. There's a hospital, and in that hospital there are some Hamas fighters, and so we have to blow up the whole hospital to get to those Hamas fighters. The whole hospital that has now become a refugee camp that is filled with sick and injured and desperate people who are looking to get away from the war. The hospital that's in a region that we told people to go to seek out safety. Because there are some operatives that we believe, we don't really have the intelligence to actually show any proof of it, we believe there may be Hamas people in there, and so therefore we have a right to drop a dumb bomb on the place, to raise the whole thing, to destroy the whole thing. And we are seeing it happen over and over again, and we are seeing the same justification used. Well, if Hamas would stop using human shields. And so they are getting us inoculated to the idea of the human shields defense, because that is going to be essential to their military strategy that they're going to employ to deal with the growing acts of resistance that we are guaranteed to see in the coming years in the U.S. and in other places, in the UK, everywhere around the world. We are in a beautiful moment of struggle where the world is not only waking up, the world is stepping out, and the world is acting together to deal with our global oppressors, these global corporations and the states that they own. Now, I realize in saying these kinds of things that it may sound like conjecture, it may sound like hyperbole. And so it's very important to ground any kind of speculation in observable phenomenon. And so one example is if we look at the current student protests that are happening, look at the militarized tactics that are being used against them. So I talked about in the last video where I was giving some kind of like overall perspective and putting things into context. I talked about the idea of kettling. Kettling as a tactic that police use for crowd control. And kettling is essentially like the bottling up of protesters into a controllable area, right? And so when we look at what's happening on the campuses, the immediate police response was to barricade and block out the campuses. They closed down all of the gates. They would not allow anyone in except students. And this began the process of kettling. Then they decided that it wasn't enough to lock the students in on campus, which is a very expansive area when you're talking about like Columbia University or you're talking about Emory and other universities. There are lots of buildings, lots of alleys, lots of places to go. And so if you look at how they approached it in Columbia, they took it from barricading them and locking them into an open, expansive encampment to forcing them into separate buildings. And that is indicative of the kind of military tactics that are going to be used, right? It's going to be the tactics of isolation and then neutralization, which essentially is just a lot of sheer brutality. You see the same thing happening at UCLA, the same thing happened at Emory. The same tactics are being used all over. That's easier to understand. It's easier to see. Police have been doing that for a while. It is a well-known tactic. But when we get into these more grandiose ideas of like turning a neighborhood or a certain geographical region into like a temporary terrorist zone and using that as a justification for amped up brutality, for outright, like unapologetic violence, even that hits bystanders, then we get into a territory where people can accuse you of fear-mongering or, oh, you're going too far now. But let's look at also what's happening with the student protests. right? Look at the way that press are being treated. Look at the way that faculty are being treated. The support and presence of faculty would normally be seen as something that would ensure the safety of protesters, and yet we see countless incidents of faculty being arrested. We even saw a presidential candidate be arrested in Jill Stein. And so we can see already evidence of this idea of like the human shield kind of defense, right? The faculty are volunteering themselves essentially as human shields, and therefore they deserve the violence that's being enacted upon them. We also need to look at the political statements being made at this time. First, you have to understand when politicians are giving speeches, there are teams of people who write the speeches. They're very big on word choice. And whenever you hear a word or phrase being repeated over and over again by a politician, you can guarantee that that is something that they're trying to drill into people's minds. And so when Tom Cotton got up and made a speech referring to the student protests, he used this phrase, little Gazas. These protest encampments are little Gazas. He said it over and over again throughout the course of a speech, and this is very important. They are starting to build the infrastructure to normalize in the public consciousness the idea that there are instances where a territory can be taken over by a terrorist presence, because Joe Biden has referred to these people as terrorists, or at least terrorist sympathizers. Other politicians have referred to these people as hate mongers and Hamas supporters. And so this language that's being used, this little Gaza's language, is intent on normalizing the concept that something can happen where a public area, where a designated geographical area can be deemed something else, something that is inherently dangerous, something that has to be dealt with in a way that wouldn't normally be acceptable or palatable to the public. Meaning that in these little Gazas, then Gaza behavior can happen, right? This all goes back to us being a primed audience. We are primed to accept certain narratives. We are primed to accept the native savage narrative, right? The indigenous savage narrative. We are primed to accept these anti-black tropes. We are primed to accept the idea that foreign invaders are here and they are manipulating the public, and that these students, that these activists, that these organizers are the puppets of foreign invaders, and if we do not stop them, it's going to lead to the demise of the country. We are primed to accept the idea that certain people are supposed to die. Certain people's lives are worth less than others. And America has a long history of punishing people who assert the bizarre notion that no, all people have a right to live. Punishing the people who ally themselves with oppressed people. And so what we are likely to start to see is out in the streets when there are mass protests, especially prolonged protests, especially encampment style protests, your kind of Occupy Wall Street protests, or your prolonged campaigns like we saw in Ferguson, where people would come out day after day. What we are likely to see is the police surrounding an area, containing a population within it, branding it through the media as a dangerous zone, a violent zone, a zone full of people who are intent on destruction, and then using that as a justification to go in and indiscriminately attack people, arrest people, even people who may not even be a part of the protest, who may just live in the area. We also have evidence in the student encampments of resource disruption. We can see that the police are blocking supplies getting into these encampments. They are shutting off resources from the outside community. If there's a certain neighborhood or area that's deemed as a problem, as a terrorist area, an area that has been taken over, that is under siege of a terrorist group, whoever they define as being terrorists in that case, then it's not too much of a stretch of imagination to imagine a situation where they would even go as far as cutting off portions of the power grid in a certain zone, maybe even cutting off the water mains in a certain zone. when we talk about things like these, like temporary terrorist zones, when we talk about psychological warfare tactics, um, we have to realize that these are not things that I'm pulling out of the air and just imagining. These are things that have actually occurred in U.S. history, and that the police are explicitly saying that they are training for. Things that we are seeing overseas in places like Palestine, and we are clear on the fact that the IOF is training along with U.S. police officers. Now, the thing you have to understand about military strategy is that the strategy has to fit the context that you're in. And there's something different about the context that we live in the U.S. versus the context that Palestinians live in. Yes, we are all colonized peoples, but we are dispersed colonized people, right? We are spread around. Now, U.S. is still very much a pretty segregated place, especially in a lot of cities. But generally speaking, we have considerably more mobility. We have the right to return. I have the right to leave my city and come back. And so our situation is different. If the IOF is the one who is training the U.S., then the understanding is, from a military point of view, the U.S. has to understand that they have to manufacture the context in which that military strategy was successful. The government understands, and the media especially understands, that they have to do the work of priming people to accept the inevitability of these kind of authoritarian tactics. And so they are beginning now with the language. They are also beginning to practice right now before our eyes in these student protests. They are showing their hand. And we need to actually pay attention and begin to organize and build movements and start to move in a way where we can circumnavigate these tactics. This doesn't mean that there's not a place for mass protest. This doesn't mean that there's not a place for encampments. It just means that when we are planning these types of actions, we have to make sure that we are approaching things on a multi-front basis and that we are not laying all of our eggs into these baskets, right? It's one of the things that we realized, even looking at Occupy Wall Street, and, you know, that kind of moment where everyone was talking about the 1% and the 99%, and people were really charged up. But when you create that very centralized moment, then all the powers that be have to do is crush the center. And organizers, young organizers especially, are on it. I am really, really impressed with the level of thought and care that students have shown in their organizing. So we have the idea of broken silence policing. This is something that's very prevalent. You can see that in Israel, people are literally being arrested for liking or commenting on posts, right? We have the renewal of the FISA Act, where they have renewed again this policy that the government does not need a warrant to engage in espionage and spying on anyone who they just write on a piece of paper, yeah, this person might be a terrorist. We have meme propaganda. We're going to continue to see these stories that are designed to run very fast and just fall off the earth. You will hear no retraction. They will be debunked, but the media will not cover the fact that they've been debunked. And they will persist in the public consciousness even far after they've been shown to be outright fabrications. The use of drones for surveillance, for psychological ops, and we will begin to see weaponized drones used in the U.S. And last but not least, we have essentially what we're going to see is the Gazification of geographical areas in order to allow the police to use all-out 100% military tactics in a domestic situation. And they will be protected by the media narrative, and any kind of collateral damage will be seen as an acceptable cost to get at these terrorists, these foreign agitators, these out-of-towners, however they want to brand it, these people who have decided to use violence, which typically is just vandalism at the most, to assert their political will. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about these topics. Please like, subscribe, share. If any of this resonates with you, then I really ask you to take a moment and be mindful and actually help put these words out there. I have a lot of ideas I'd like to share. I really would like to do a video really going into what I see as some of the potential solutions for some of these tactics that are gonna be used, but some of that I feel comfortable talking about, and some of it is just like, oh, these ideas are just too good. I want to hold on to. So I would rather talk to people about these kind of things in person, and really establish comradeship with organizers and organizations. And so if you're a part of an organization or you are just interested in getting involved, I really would like to make more connections with people, especially if you're in the mid-Atlantic or the Southeast. I would love to connect with people who are on the ground organizing for Free Palestine, organizing against to stop cop cities, and other issues that are involving the black community in particular and just oppressed people at large. So feel free to hit me up or in the comments. If you'd rather just have a public conversation, that's fine. But I really would enjoy hearing from people in any way that you feel comfortable, and we can continue this dialogue. Again, I'm just Mike, and this is Drawing the Line. Thank you for watching.